Thank you. So we'll go to our first round of questioning, and we'll begin with 6 minutes or less for Mr. Kimmich.
Thank you, Chair. So, Professor Lilly, I wanted to go back to a comment you made that we need to be relevant to countries in the region, and then you described some of the failures in the Indo-Pacific strategy to be relevant. So I'm just going to quote here from the Canada West Foundation report, one of their briefing notes that they put out online. It says, repeated studies have found that an LNG export industry equivalent to 30 million tons per annum in British Columbia would inject about $7.4 billion into the Canadian economy over 30 years, along with supporting 65,000 jobs. And then goes on to explain that the export opportunities are mostly in Asia and LNG markets. When you talked about the failures, you said time is precious. Do you think we've missed the boat on an opportunity to export Canadian LNG into Asian markets?
I don't think, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I don't think that we have necessarily missed the boat, but there's a lot more we could be doing. We have sent some of our allies packing, telling them that there's none left for them. We're not going to build additional infrastructure beyond what is coming. And so, I'm excited about the successes that we have, but we have to do a lot more. And the messages that Canada is sending right now are very mixed, and lots of countries wonder why we aren't doing more to provide them with the LNG that they need, particularly in the current climate. And so we're seeing other partnerships go around Canada, essentially, to secure energy from partners that are willing to sell it to them, including the United States.
Are there any specific countries like Japan, beyond Japan, because Japan is the typical example that's given for an opportunity, or used to be an opportunity for Canadian LNG? Are there any other markets that we could reach as a country through the Indo-Pacific strategy that you see that could use our energy supply as a safe source of supply?
Well, in the past, I know that Korea has been interested, and I don't know whether they've moved on at this point to seek from others. But whenever these conversations come up, and I think, I'm fortunate being in Ottawa that I'm regularly invited to speak with foreign diplomats that are here, and the message that they constantly receive is that this isn't something Canada wants to explore, and so how many times they ask and are rebuffed before they move on to others that are happy to sell to them, I couldn't say.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Professor Nagy, then I have a question, because you said mini-lateral deals. So why shouldn't we have a mini-lateral deal with, say, the government of Japan to export our LNG to them? Wouldn't that be an example of kind of using our comparative advantage, which is our West Coast access LNG export to a country like Japan? Couldn't we do a mini-lateral deal with the government of Japan to help them get the energy that they need?
So thank you very much for the question. So when I speak of mini-lateralism, I'm thinking about partnerships with 3 or 4 countries to deal with one potential functional issue. So I think that export to Japan on LNG would be a bilateral agreement. And here, when we're talking about bilateral agreement, the comparative advantages may be Japan's ability to build the technologies to export the LNG, and Canada would be the provider. So I think you're slightly mischaracterizing what I mean by mini-lateral. But I'm fully on the same page that I think that this is a partnership that has comparative advantages and shared interests, and that there's an opportunity for Japan to be a country that helps Canada open up its markets to energy resources, not only to Japan, but to key partners within the region.
So, Professor Nagy, then I'm going to go back to the Canada-Japan Action Plan. 2022, this was 6 areas were outlined in it between Ottawa and Tokyo, and they agreed to bolster cooperation. This is from your writing, so I'm just referencing it. Point number 5 talked about energy security. So wouldn't LNG exports and providing more of clean-burning Canadian energy to a market like Japan help them meet their energy needs, while also removing other sources of energy that are from conflict zones, or their over-reliance on other countries that are not as secure a supplier the way Canadians are? Like, I thought this action plan that you've referenced in the past in your writing could form the basis of like maybe this mini-lateral deals with other countries as well, could it not?
Absolutely. So I think here we've lost an opportunity with some of our environmental policies back in Canada, where we have not been able to export to the countries that actually rely on safe, transparent, and stable energy resources. And that's something that Canada can be. Again, I think it can be an energy superpower, whether it's through this joint action plan with Japan or working with 3 or 4 other countries within the region to build those steady supply chains of energy, but also critical minerals to the region to ensure that their economies are stable and that they can continue to provide the goods that they do to Canada and Canadian citizens.
Very short, Chair. So for a country like Japan, how important it is to have a safe and stable supply of energy?
It's critical. They don't have indigenous energy resources. They export nearly 90 to 95% of their energy. And to work with a stable country like Canada that has huge energy resources would be a key asset. And I would advocate deepening that relationship and in using our energy and critical resources to benefit Canadians, but also to be that energy superpower that supplies the 3rd largest economy on the planet.
Thank you, Mr. Kimmich. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for sharing your expertise with us tonight. Professor Lilly, just want to give you a chance to help me with both not being afraid of China as a trading partner, and also then your subsequent comment about really weaponizing trade as they have done in the past. You didn't use that word, but they have weaponized trade a number of times with Canada on a number of products, mostly Western Canadian products, but not completely. Help me with that one about opening, availability, recognizing the reality of China, also recognizing that we have a past that's problemed, and then all the other issues you mentioned, like labor and forced labor, et cetera.
Sure. Thank you, through the chair. Thank you for your question. Yeah, so what I meant by my comment where I said that China is the major trade partner, it's not just that Canada needs to think about its own trade interests with China, it's that every country in the Indo-Pacific, their major trading partner is China. So just as Canada is very dependent on our bilateral trading partner with the United States, all of those countries are very dependent on their trade relationship with China. And so, and that goes for something like the CPTPP, where, Canada and Mexico are very much a different animals in that arrangement, because all other countries in the CPTPP have very strong trade ties with China first, the United States and or other markets second. So one of the things that means is that we need to be aware of the ways in which we're trading with those other countries. They are behaving the same way towards us that we behave when we think about trading with the United States. So we're both thinking about our respective elephant in the room. And we need to make sure that our own trade rules and trade behavior is cognizant of that. So that's one point. The second point is that, yes, we shouldn't be afraid to stand up to China, particularly in instances where it is Canada's national interest at play, and we know that China will weaponize trade against Canada. In my view, China will continue to import products from Canada when it wants to, when it is in China's interest to do so. There's some evidence that when it banned canola, Canadian canola, this was not just about the detention of the 2 Michaels, but there happened to be, during that same period of time, a record canola crop in China. And so it was quite convenient to reduce the amount of Canadian canola going to China at that time. And so I think that we just have to be extremely smart about it, and we must not at any time, in my view, sacrifice our goals as a country out of fear that China might turn around and reduce market access.
And quickly, you mentioned that we should have clear criteria with respect to CPTPP and the accession of new members. I think we have a reputation of being very clear, having added the progressive nature to that agreement. and just the hoops that UK went through to get into that world. What are you suggesting in addition to what we're doing now that would be helpful?
So Canada, as chair this year, is in a unique position to help steer that conversation. The accession of new members to CPTPP, though, is by consensus. And the reality is that while Canada and some others have serious concerns about the entry of China, there are other members that would like China to enter. I think that one of a good process to follow in attempting to depoliticize these issues and not make it solely about China, because if we make it about China, China will make it about Taiwan and so on. We instead follow a clear criteria on things like, to what extent does your country allow foreign investment in? How do you treat Canadian companies in your economy? And using that existing record of success or not to evaluate the applications, and not to accept promises of behavior change in the future as criteria that would allow potentially a very large member to be accepted into TPP.
Thank you. I want to turn to Professor Nagy. You mentioned North Korea as being an area that a country we need to work with. You're the first person I have heard say that in several years. So I'm just wondering what you mean by working with North Korea.
I don't think I said that. I said that we need to work with other countries to deal with the challenge of North Korea. The reality, North Korea's weapons of mass destruction and proliferation are a challenge to
I think,
the region.
yeah, thank you for that clarification, because you did say it, actually, and we all noticed it, and eyebrows were all raised around the table. So thanks for I wanted you to clarify, because I didn't think that's what you meant.
No, not at all.
Okay, so this clarification is important. When you talk about the focusing of the IPS in certain regions and not in other regions, what criteria are you using to make those decisions? Like, what are you saying should be? Obviously, it's Canadian interests. Obviously, we have values, all those things which we all know. But you've been very specific about some targeting within the IPS, which I think is already quite targeted. What are the criteria that you have used to suggest South China Sea, et cetera?
We'll ask for a brief answer, Professor Nagy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think an abidance of rule of law is critical to which countries we choose to deepen our relationship, to converge strategic interests. This creates more opportunities to work with countries that don't share the same political system, for example, Vietnam. And this is a challenge. How do we match these two contradictory positions? If we want to have a sustained position within the Indo-Pacific, and in particular in and around Southeast Asia, we're going to have some flexibility of how we deal with countries with different political systems. So in terms of criteria, countries like South Korea, Japan, Singapore are clear priorities, but we need to have some flexibility to ensure that we have partnerships with countries that don't share the same respect for democracy and human rights and rule of law, such as Vietnam. I think that this is the only way to have a sustained, meaningful presence in a heterogeneous region that has so many different political systems.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. We'll now go to Monsieur Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to our two witnesses for being in attendance this evening. I think that your opening briefs and your responses to our answers will shed a lot of light on issues. Professor Lilly, now, right off the bat, and it will be useful for Mr. or Professor Nagy, who wasn't able to hear your initial testimony, but at the outset, you described a situation of Canada's economic reliance on the United States, which oftentimes demonstrates just how easy or not easy it is for Canadian businesses to do business with the United States. So we choose the path of ease most often. We often tend to put all our eggs in one basket, and that therefore when the United States adopts highly protectionist policies, that has a bearing on our economy, on our businesses, and as the old adage goes, when the United States sneezes, well, we feel the full brunt of it here back in Canada. So I don't know, but I'm asking the question of both of you. I don't know if you agree with me, but I get the sense with one of the unadmitted objectives of the Indo-Pacific strategy is to diversify our economy. And there have been many attempts in the past in that vein, under the Pierre Elliott Trudeau government, under the Jean Chrétien government, and thereafter under the Stephen Harper government. All of those endeavours, all of those efforts in the past were not successful, or at least not successful to the extent hoped for. So my question is directed at both witnesses. And in fact, Professor Lilly, you alluded to this when you referred to the need to deal with various countries under the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, to my question, how will the Indo-Pacific strategy, in your opinion, ensure our success where we've so often failed in the past?
Merci pour la question.
Well, thank you for the question.
So how will the Indo-Pacific strategy help us succeed? I'll be honest, I'm not sure that we will move from our current situation of it's upwards of 75% of Canadian exports now go to the United States. I'm not sure we'll see much of a change to that. I would agree with you that the Indo-Pacific strategy is framed as something that is supposed to help Canada diversify its trade. But the reality is that, as I said in my opening comments, only once a company is exporting to the United States will they also consider exporting anywhere else, the Indo-Pacific, Europe, anywhere else. It's, the small minority are just exporting somewhere other than the United States. So as we diversify, we also will trade more with the United States as a result. That is just what our firms will do. And it's not that Canada is lazy in my view. This happens the world over. In all regions of the world, you are most likely to trade with your neighbors and with large economies. Our next door neighbor happens to be the world's largest economy. And so, it fits theory and evidence that we do that. And so while I think it is important for us to trade with other economies because it can help in our relationship with the United States to demonstrate that we have relevance elsewhere, to demonstrate to the United States how we can be helpful to them, I will be honest, I think that thinking about trading with the Indo-Pacific as a way to move away from the United States is not the right tack, and I don't think it will be successful.
Monsieur Nagui.
Merci pour la question.
Professor Nagy.
Professor Lilly, with regards to the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, I don't think it is an effort to diversify away from the United States. I think it is an effort to diversify away from an overdependence on the Chinese market. We've seen investments in Southeast Asia. We have Paul Topol, who's based in Indonesia right now. He is our trade representative there. We've opened up an office in Manila. We are likely to invest more resources in Singapore. So I think these are key elements to diversify away from China. That doesn't mean decouple, and I would like to be very clear about that. It means diversify away from the potential weaponization and monopolization of trade by China that could harm Canadian interests. In terms of the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, I think that this is quite clear. How do we manage our relationship with the United States and our economic overdependence on the United States? I think that we should use the market to be more competitive, but also to understand how we can be diversify not only with the United States, but within the United States to create more economic opportunity for Canadians. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Peut-être.
Well, perhaps I could just make a segue into my second line of questioning. Now, in your article in August 2021, Why Does Canada Need an Indo-Pacific Strategy as part of its foreign policy, Professor Nagy, you're in favour of a strategy that would optimise opportunities for Canada, tailored to the challenges of the region, and would create an independent Canadian trademark such that Canada wouldn't be perceived as a poor second cousin to the United States. Now, we're kind of caught up in the dilemma, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? How do we diversify our trade, and how do we do so without being perceived on the world stage as being in cahoots or poor second cousin to the US?
Mr. Bergeron, your 6 minutes have expired, but we'll park that question with Mr. Nagy, and next round he may be having the time to give you the answer you're looking for. But right now we'll go to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses for being here today and sharing your expertise with us. I am interested in your discussion or your comments on diversifying. And last week we heard from witness testimony that talked about that even when we diversify, even when we are working with other countries in the region, we are in fact still working with China because of those close relationships that they have. I'm looking at that context. I'm also looking at the United States, where we're talking about the idea of our overdependence on trade with the U.S. and a potential Trump presidency, which could be extremely difficult for our trade relationships going forward. And I'm just curious, what are those things that Canada needs to do to increase that diversification? And frankly, we've had this Indo-Pacific strategy for some time now. Has this led to any diversification from your perspective to this point? Dr. Lilly, maybe I'll start with you if I could.
Thank you. Through the chair. So has any diversification happened yet? It's difficult to say. And part of the challenge in assessing that is that the Indo-Pacific strategy was officially launched a year ago. Since the pandemic, while the Minister of Trade and others are very fond of saying that Canadian trade is higher than ever and we've been trading more than ever, the reality is that we know for a fact that Canada's increased trade since 2020 is the result of inflation, not increased volumes of trade. And so, for instance, this is in the Global Affairs Canada 2023 report from Global Affairs itself. And so what we know is that higher prices is what's fueling Canada's increased trade with the United States and others. So if you're looking at any figures, you have to recognize that even a $2 billion increase or a $20 billion increase, first you have to ask yourself, is this the result of prices or increased volumes of trade? Because we know volumes of trade are actually down and have not recovered. A couple of things that I think we can do, though, and that are important. First, just because we don't trade very much with the Indo-Pacific doesn't mean those exercises aren't important, particularly if it helps us build relationships for the long term for other reasons. So we're talking about wanting, for instance, to sign an FTA with ASEAN, but Global Affairs Canada's own assessments say that if we were to sign a deal, it would increase trade exports by Canada by $2.7 billion per year. It's frankly a rounding error when you think of the relationship with the United States. So, $2.7 billion, great, but it's still not a huge amount of trade. But if that helps us improve our relationships and help both sides who have our respective elephants in the room think about ways to cooperate with each other without always thinking about China or the United States, I think that's good. And so middle powers finding ways to be that fabric that keeps the global trading system together, where the two big powers aren't necessarily in the room or guiding the direction of that, I think can be a really positive contribution we can make.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Nagy, anything from your perspective?
I just add, I think that when we're talking about diversification of trade, I think we probably need to think about a sectoral approach to the diversification of trade. So Western Canada has different comparative advantages, energy and agricultural resources that were definitely needed throughout the region, where services and other products that can be delivered to Canada may be more suitable to Southeast Asia. So again, I think that we need a more nuanced approach to thinking about what we mean by diversification, but we also need a federal government that's going to unleash or release some of the untapped resources that exist within Canada. And right now, I think in terms of energy and critical security, our critical minerals, this is an area that many of the countries within the region are very interested in, but they find the current policies of the federal government frustrating because they're not able to get the kinds of resources that will create more economic security for the partners within the region. But we should be very clear, it's not serving Canadians either.
Thank you. Well, and I guess one of the next questions I have, and perhaps I'll start with you, Dr. Nagy, is with regards to risks to Canadian businesses. You know, we spoke about forced labor. There were some comments about that. So far, the only piece of legislation that has come out from the Canadian government is S211, which you know the NDP didn't support because we didn't think it was near sufficient. We have been told that other legislation would come forward, and it has not to date done that. What are the risks to Canadian companies? What are the risks that forced goods made with forced labor are getting into our supply chains, and what should Canada be doing to stop that?
So in general, I think issues such as forced labor are a moral issue, but I think the real risks to Canadian businesses really revolve around supply chains, sea lines of communication, and if there is a potential kinetic conflict within the region, how will this disrupt critical technologies such as semiconductors being exported into the manufacturing sectors in Canada? Let me just give you an example. Of course, semiconductors is all the fashion, but in reality, those semiconductors go into the automobile factories that are producing cars in Canada and employing Canadians. So if we have a challenge across the Taiwan Straits or in the South China Sea that will disrupt these sea lines of communications, this will affect the automobile industries in Canada and the prospects for Canadian citizens. So I think that we need to look at this in a more complex way. Any businesses in Canada that use products from the region, whether it is critical minerals, lithium, semiconductors, or small parts, will all be affected by some kind of conflict within the region. And I don't mean to downplay the forced labor issue, because I think it's really, really important. But I unfortunately, I think it's a moral issue that I'm not sure that we can deal with. And we need to think about, again, the challenges associated with sea lines of communication and the weaponization of supply chains. But again, thank you very much for the thoughtful question.
And thank you, Ms. McPherson. That's your 6 minutes. We will now go to Mr. Chong for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask a question for Madam Lilly. You've advised a former Prime Minister on foreign affairs and international trade, and so I'd like to ask you a question about LNG exports. As you know, 15 years ago, the United States exported virtually no LNG. I looked it up. Last year, they exported about 4.5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, of LNG natural gas. It's not inconceivable that Canada could export 4.5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which would, add, some almost 0.5% of GDP right there, if not more. And so, if you were working in a Prime Minister's office, what legislative, regulatory, and machinery of government changes need to be put into place to get us to a 4.5 trillion cubic feet of LNG exports? Maybe we can start with the machinery of government.
Thank you for the question. Some of this will be beyond my expertise. I can certainly speak to the trade side of things and some of the regulatory pieces. Certainly, everyone singing from the same song sheet is helpful in terms of across departments of government, across federal, provincial partnerships, including municipalities, including Indigenous populations, and ensuring that Indigenous populations can benefit. There's an imperative there, really, that everyone does have to be rowing in the same direction. I don't think that we have that today. I think as well, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of language from the top. It really does matter. And so when prime ministers are visited by foreign heads of state whose hand is out asking for LNG and they say, no, we've moved on, there's no business case for that, that's incredibly damaging, not just to that relationship, but to the rest of the world that is also watching. and I know your question is specific to LNG, but the other concern that I have about this is that that same experience and mentality that everyone who is watching has, they then take and they transfer to Canada's critical minerals approach right now. So they say, well, they can't build that pipeline. They had to sell it to the government. They can't. They've canceled several LNG projects. Now they say that they care about critical minerals because it's the right kind of energy, only we're pretty sure that they can't get all of these regulatory processes through. There doesn't appear to be any urgency or sense that we must move much, much, much faster. And so it's important for all of those things to be moving together in tandem. Those are a couple of the things I would say from a trade perspective.
You know, I noticed in other countries that the government is much more directly involved when it comes to LNG imports and exports than we are. You know, the German government directly ordered the construction of 6 new LNG facilities, some of which have already come online. Japan's government just, I think, about a month ago ordered, I think, Mitsubishi to purchase, to sign long-term LNG import contracts. We've not traditionally had that close relationship between the government and our oil and gas sector that you see outside of North America. So I'm wondering how we can get government and industry working more closely together to meet what I believe is in Canada's strategic defense and security interests, which is to get more LNG to global markets, particularly for allies like Japan and Germany, to reduce reliance on authoritarian states for those critical energy supplies. And so I'm wondering what machinery of government changes are required, what regulatory and legislative changes are required in order for us to get the kind of speed to market that we see in places like Japan and Germany.
I think a lot of it actually does come down to political will. I have been very impressed at the speed with which the minister, the ISED minister, Champagne, has put political will behind the EV battery plants, and we've seen rapid movement around regulatory approvals, all departments of government, cooperation with the provinces, and that has happened very, very quickly at lightning speed by Canadian standards. So I think it's entirely possible, but I would agree that I don't think it has been prioritized that way in natural resources.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We'll now go to Ms. Yip for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you both for coming tonight. Professor Lilly, you mentioned in your opening statement that unlike the U.S., who have taken steps to de-risk the supply chains, Canada has been reactive. What steps could Canada take to be more proactive in this area?
Thank you for the question. I think we could be doing a number of things. One is that we have to be looking for problems, and that takes resources and money. So Canada tends to adopt a reactive approach in that we rely on reporting in voluntary attestations of what's in shipments, and then we take people's word for it that what they say is in the box is in the box. And what we have to do is much more proactive investigation of imports. Certainly on the forced labor side of things, that is something that we have to do. There was a story last year, and I have not been able to investigate the veracity of it, but that in the Globe and Mail that the United States had 1,300 had intervened against 1,300 shipments to Canada's one on forced labor. It's just not possible that there isn't a more comparable, if we have a 10-to-1 ratio, we should have at least 130 cases in Canada. So if we're not looking, we're not going to see things. And we can't just rely on attestations and company reports when we're looking at these things. And there are a number of things. I should say Canada-US does have a supply chain investigation group, cooperative group. It has an interesting work plan. I have not yet seen the results of that, but we are looking at some integrated supply chain aspects, and I look forward to seeing the reporting out of that.
So you're suggesting we need more teeth?
We need more?
More teeth.
Absolutely. Yeah. If we care about these things, we should implement them well. And if we don't care about these things, we should stop talking about them, is my honest view.
Thank you. Professor Nagy, you suggested that Canada pursue mini-lateral partnerships to deal with particular issues, including disinformation. I believe you mentioned Taiwan and Australia as potential partners in this area. How might Canada work with these countries and other Indo-Pacific nations to counter disinformation?
Thank you very much, Ms. Yip, for your question. So first, I think we have to recognize Taiwan as what it is. It's a political entity according to our One China policy, and we need to be very clear about that. But they are on the forefront of disinformation from China. And as a result, they have the experience and they have the institutions to be able to, I think, be kind of the central nexus to help Canada deal with some of the disinformation challenges that we face within our own relationship between Canada and China. I also mentioned South Korea. South Korea faces disinformation challenges with regards to the North. And again, I think collectively using the different kinds of experiences that these countries on the forefront of disinformation have will be critical in terms of identifying disinformation, finding ways to combat disinformation and push back on disinformation. I include Australia because Australia's experience over the past several years with China has been very difficult. It also has experience in managing disinformation. And this is why I've advocated for, again, the collection of Taiwan, South Korea, perhaps Japan, Australia, and the United States to work with Canada to, again, share the patterns of disinformation that they've identified, the processes of which they push back. And I think importantly, how do we educate our citizens to, again, be more critical of the kind of information they read online so that, that we don't have to, or we can preempt the challenges that are associated with disinformation. So this is how I am envisioning a mini-lateral partnership between these countries and political entities.
Thank you.
We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Alors, Monsieur Nagy.
Professor Nagy, I don't know if you remember my question from a moment ago, but it's now time to respond to it.
Great. I honestly, I think a Canadian brand is very important, and a Canadian brand is going to include focusing on our comparative advantages. I think currently the Asia-Pacific Foundation is doing quite an interesting job in turning about focusing on agricultural-related technologies and spearheading those initiatives in Southeast Asia. I think that other areas that we could focus is on education and, again, energy and critical minerals. These are comparative advantages that Canada has, and we need to develop a distinct brand that sees us as stable, sees us as having good services, and, again, a stable supplier of these within the region. I don't think that we have, these are important because we can have a position that's distinct from the United States, but at the same time, this doesn't mean that we're in an antagonistic relationship with the United States. So again, education, agricultural, critical minerals, agriculture-related technology, and climate-related technology, I think are some key advantages that we can build a brand to engage within the region.
Et que diriez-vous de cette...
And what would you say to the claim that Canada has failed twice to get a UN Security Council seat on the basis that in developing countries it's increasingly perceived, we're increasingly perceived as an extension of the United States on certain issues across the world, particularly the Israel-Palestine conflict?
I think Canada has an increasingly challenged relationship in terms of not having a principled approach to many issues. This is not so much related to the United States, but a track record over the past 10 years or 15 years. You mentioned the conflict in Gaza. This is an example what is our principled position on Gaza, and this does create challenges in terms of how countries developing countries see Canada as an independent thinker on issues, and we've really moved away from, I think, that position where we are an honest stakeholder or broker between Canada and other countries, or United States and other countries. We need to move back to that principled approach where we chart out a Canadian path and not a path that is necessarily always aligned with the United States. But maybe let's be clear, we are aligned with the United States on many issues because we share an economy, we have many shared cultural issues, we have respect for rule of law, and as a result, I think we will naturally be aligned with the United States on more issues than we're not.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Now to Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Nagy, or Dr. Nagy, I'm going to start with you. You talked about the fact that forced labor was a moral issue, and I have to push back on that a little bit. And the reason for that is I do believe that it actually has economic impacts when we are seen by the rest of the world as not having, as you say, a principled position. You know, Dr. Lilly, you talked about the global fabric and that role that Canada has to play. If we abdicate our responsibilities with regards to forced labor, if we are not seen as having principled positions on a number of different fronts, if we apply human rights, if we apply, these principles inequitably in different situations, I think it's very problematic. You know, even the way that we're seeing China interact in sub-Saharan Africa and South America right now, and we are increasingly absent from those spaces, that is an economic danger to us, not just an ethical or moral issue, I guess. So I'm actually going to pass it to Dr. Lilly first, just on her comment on that, and then if we have time, Dr. Nagy.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think it is obviously a moral issue, but also an economic issue, and some of that is because for all the reasons that we know, modern-day slavery and forced labor is awful. It also, for the countries that practice it, means that goods are cheaper in those places. And so when Canada is, for instance, in the world of critical minerals, much of the world's cobalt is harvested by enslaved children in Congo and other places in sub-Saharan Africa. All of that is awful, and we should fight it for all of the right reasons. It also reduces the global price of cobalt to a level below what the market should be paying, and that is bad for us, frankly. And so I don't like to put it in those self-interested terms, but it is all related. And so it's essential that we address those issues. It does make trade more expensive. It does make commodities more expensive, but that is part of the point.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We now have time for 2 more slots, and we'll start with Mr. Chong for 5 minutes or less.
I think Mr. Seebeck
Mr. Seebeck?
wants around, yes.
There you go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's so hard to decide what questions to raise. Dr. Lilly, CPTPP or pursuing one-off free trade deals in the Indo-Pacific, what would you say? Bring people into CPTPP or pursue one-off trade deals?
You'll have lots of time because it's straightforward for me. It's CPTPP.
Okay.
I think one-off trade deals are a bad idea. I think CPTPP is a it's a first-gen agreement, meaning that it's a top agreement, high standards, and so we should want to trade with economies that can play at that level, and if they can't, I don't know why we want to pursue free trade agreements with them.
Thank you. When you look at trade with China, how would you think the course forward is for Canada? I mean, I know we're not going to get a deal like the U.S. got on their Phase 1, but would pursuing some kind of a more, because we have so many trade irritants and the unilateral ability of China to impose all kinds of things on Canadian trade, what would you say would be the right course to try and pursue a better trade arrangement, for a lack of a better term, with China? Or is there?
I'm not sure we'll win that game. So I truly think that China will continue to import from Canada when it serves China's interest. And at the moment, we're under WTO MFN tariffs. They're already quite low in most things. And so We could pursue some narrow sectoral trade arrangements. They're supposed to technically be illegal under the WTO, but this is the direction the United States has gone, and they've kind of said, just watch me, and it seems to be working for them. So if we wanted to pursue some narrow sectoral arrangements in agriculture or in meat and minerals and that kind of thing, we could, if they wanted to do so as well. But without that, we may, status quo might be the best that we can do.
Switching back to forced labor, under CUSMA or USMCA, there are provisions that prohibit the importation of goods made with slave labor. United States has put together an entities list. They also have set the standard lower. If they suspect the business is engaged in their supply chain using forced labor, they have to prove they're not, and until they do, you can't come in. Canada won't copy the entities list. Canada's set the standard that CBSA has to prove that it's been used with forced labor. Should the government, for lack of a better term, smarten up and change the system to like the United States to ensure we don't have forced labor in our supply chains?
Thank you for the question. I think certainly if there's evidence in certain specific regions where we know that forced labor is ubiquitous, then yes, I would say that kind of adopting that negative list approach would be smart. It doesn't surprise me, and I think I'm familiar with the position of the Canadian government that they don't want to do that. I would agree with you that I think we need to grow up a little bit.
Are you familiar? I am getting in, as we say sometimes, getting into the weeds. Are you familiar with the U.S. entities list and how they've come about with that list?
I'm familiar with the list, but I don't know how they've developed it.
Do you think it would make sense for Canada? I mean, they're one of our closest allies. Wouldn't it make sense for us to be more aligned with the United States on this, to look at using their entities list? It seems like a very simple solution to a problem.
Using their list, or at least following a similar process, could make a lot of sense. During the USMCA negotiations, an area of real dispute between Canada and the U.S. was over the transshipment of Chinese steel. And the United States had concerns that steel bound for the United States was coming in through Canada.
Yes.
We can't afford to have Canadian exports to the United States cut off out of American concerns. For instance, there could be goods produced with forced labor being transited through Canada. So, I mean, on its own, we should not be allowing that to happen because it's bad, but separately, it's also bad for Canadian interests directly.
You're just about out of time.
Okay.
In fact, so close you are out
All
of
right,
time.
I am now.
All right.
Okay.
We will go to Mr. Frankistatos for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to both of you for being here tonight. Professor Lilly, you've said many very interesting things here tonight. I always like to give witnesses the chance to kind of summarize, if they like, your main argument for us, or what you would want us to really take away from your perspective as a committee in terms of a recommendation for the government that you think is of critical importance. I realize I'm probably forcing you to repeat yourself way back to your testimony, but a lot has been said since then, so I'd just like you to offer that opportunity to you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think if the committee could take away this reality that trade diversification goes through the United States, I think that would be a good thing. As much as we seem to understand it, we constantly try to forget that reality. And so when we're trying to diversify trade, we must do it in a way that works for that primordial trading relationship. And then I think also just being much more realistic, forward-leaning about supply chain resilience, the increasing marriage of national security with economic security. I mean, the Business Council of Canada came out with a report called that. If business is figuring this out, then we really should also be figuring it out. And so working to ensure that when we're operating in the Indo-Pacific and advancing our relationships with Indo-Pacific countries, that we do it in a manner that's consistent with all those things.
Okay. I know sometimes academics think and really even worry is the right word as to whether or not people read their articles. And I see that in 2017 you did publish a piece called "How Demographic Transition Can Help Predict Canada Trade Relations in 25 Years." So a very interesting piece. So rest assured, people are reading your stuff for sure. Can I ask you about, and it's a very general question, but I wonder, do you think that demography and understanding Canada's demography has utility in this whole discussion about Canada-China relations?
Yes,
demography
absolutely.
Okay.
I think that we often forget the importance of demography, aging populations. China has an aging population. There's lots of commentary that perhaps its economy has peaked. If you look at the aging demographic profile of China, that makes lots of sense. And if you look at markets where we should be spending more time thinking this one is rising, we should be thinking a lot more about Mexico, actually.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Mr. Nagy, if I could. Last week, Mr. Nagy, we heard from someone else from the Patterson School, and that is Professor Hampson, who told us not to worry about the BRICS at that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, obviously, and the alliance, if you can call it that, has grown a bit recently. He said not to worry about it right now, but Canada might have to worry about it in 5 years, and plan accordingly. That was his basic argument. What do you make of an argument like that? Thinking ahead, I think these are questions that we do have to keep in mind.
Thank you very much for the question. So I think the expansion of the BRICS committee is meant to create alternatives to the U.S. currency being one of the global reserve currencies and perhaps eventually internationalizing the renminbi. But in the reality, when we look at the heterogeneity of the BRICS and the expansion of the members, I really don't think it provides the kind of economic foundation that would be a viable alternative to the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency in 5 years or 10 years. Can it make the substantial changes in each of those countries to be more reliable, stable in terms of creating a viable alternative reserve currency to the United States? It's possible, but there's a lot of stars to align to make that happen. As Canada looks to BRICS and it looks to its ability to I think, be a viable alternative to, I guess, a Western-led or a U.S.-led global financial system. I think that we should be more aware of how the BRICS represents really the global South or developing countries and how they may have a position in shaping some of the choices within international institutions such as the United Nations, et cetera. So I'm a little bit more, I guess, pessimistic about BRICS being a viable financial alternative to the current U.S.-led financial order. But at the same time, I do recognize that they have a bigger voice and they can shape the global South, and this can affect Canada's engagement internationally.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fragaskatos. That brings us to the end of our first panel. Professor Lilly, thank you for your time. Professor Nagy, boy, it must be a beastly hour of the morning where you are right now. You're looking surprisingly chipper for the hour of day that you're dealing with, so you can go throw yourself in front of a vat of coffee or something and get on with the rest of your day. But thank you both for being here. We will suspend while we set up for our next panel.